Hi, it's Andy, and we are preparing for another week in Romans 5, verses 12 through 14. Glad you could join us again today, and I do welcome you to these video sermons, and hopefully you're finding value in these. Hopefully you're also finding value in the daily videos that are happening, at least most of the time they are happening. So this week, I'm going to dive in the daily videos a little bit deeper into some challenges and into one of the reasons why biblical theology is so important. That'll be on Wednesday's video. But I do want to remind you that obviously the cases, I don't need to remind you, I'm telling you what you already know, the cases here in Atchison County related to COVID are increasing. And so be careful. We understand that there are many that are not, that have no desire to come and to be a part of the congregation right now here. That does not mean that you cannot be a part of the church or that you are not a part of the church, depending upon whether you have come in the past or not. But there is something to be said for fellowship. So I do just want to say that, you know, one day I believe this will be passed. I don't know how soon that will be. I think it's many months, perhaps more from now. Despite, you know, the good news here or there about a potential vaccination and stuff. But it's one thing to watch television. It's one thing to watch your computer. It's one thing to watch these sermons. But just as you watching a television show doesn't make you a part of the show, watching a sermon doesn't make you a part of a church. And again, I know this is an exceptional time, but for those that may be tuning in for the first time to our church, or for those that might be checking us out online only, great. I appreciate it. But just know that the Bible speaks very highly about fellowship. It talks about the fact of the church being a part of the family of God, that we are children of God, and children are to gather, children are to be together. So again, one day this will pass, and hopefully many will return, but we have to make plans in other ways. So I will say, though, again, as I do each week, that we do appreciate your contributions as you can. You can give online, fairfaxmobaptistchurch.org, and click on the Give button, and you can set that up on a recurring basis or a one-time gift or whatever for that if you wish. My wife and I did that. I've said this last couple of weeks, but my wife and I did that a couple of weeks ago, or probably a month and a half or so ago now, and it's just really nice. It just automatically comes out each week, and then I just make up a little bit here and there when I have some extra income. So that works well. But or you can send your check to Fairfax Baptist Church, P.O. Box 350, Fairfax, Missouri 64446. And again, there are lights on right now. There's the cost of paying for the internet and all those kinds of things. So cost of paying me, let's just be real. We still have costs going on, and there's some mission things that we are working on as well. In fact, I would encourage you to check out our Facebook page today. We are helping a church in Kenya to be built. They are building a structure, and so we will have pictures. We're going to show those pictures Sunday morning here. We will show but we'll put those on Facebook too, so you can get a picture, and they're hoping to be done with this by the middle of next week. So just a great gift that we can give to this church at Lashura in the Samburu area of Kenya. So a place that I've visited a few times, and just wonderful to know that they're actually going to have a building there. Anyway, without further ado, we will turn to Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. And I hope this encourages you, although today's not the encouragement. Watch next week for the rest of this message. This is really kind of a part 1 of 2. One of the most challenging things for us to consider is, why did God allow sin? God is all-knowing. God is all-wise. And yet, the prime creation, the premier creation, the one part of creation that was created in His image, that being humanity, is the one who sinned and has caused not only mankind to struggle, but as Romans 8 makes clear, all of creation to groan, all of creation to cry out. So Why did God allow us to sin? Well, that question may be answered by God someday, but the reality is that God has given us free will. And therefore you might ask, well, why would he give us free will if he knew that we might sin? My statement is very simple, that he loves us, that he gives us that choice. He gives us that opportunity because of love. He doesn't want to turn us into robots or anything. But because God has allowed us to do this, because of the question of sin, many people think that God is evil. In fact, many atheists will use an argument something similar to the fact of, well, if a girl is raped, if a young girl is raped, and God allowed that to happen, then God must be evil. Well, again, my argument to that would be God did not rape the girl. That would be like saying if, my son or my daughter did something that they knew they weren't supposed to do, it's my fault, even though maybe I told them not to do it. And essentially, that's what God did with Adam, with the man in the garden, is saying, don't eat from that tree. And Adam did it anyway. So again, why he might allow Adam to do that, we could question, but is God evil because he gave someone a choice of good? In fact, we must understand that from Genesis 2, every animal came before Adam. And Adam named those animals. It's not that God couldn't have, but God gave Adam the choice to name animals. And God gave a woman to Adam, and he gave Adam everything, and he gave Eve everything except for one. And they chose that one, which is really no different than us. But God created us with a will, with a free will, because he loves us. So the problem is that our will chooses sin. The title of this sermon today is about the problem in the world. The problem in the world is sin, and that is because our will chooses sin. We think of sin as fun. We think of it as pleasing. And in many cases, it is, at least for a while, right? I mean, we might say, well, it's not going to hurt me to do this, which is really an indication to say, it might hurt me to do this, and if it might hurt me to do this, then it's probably not the right thing to do. Or well, I really shouldn't be doing this, but, again, we know the right thing to do sometimes, but we don't do it because our will. The reality is that it's like sin is in our DNA. You sin, I sin, as Paul says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. And so it's like sin is in our DNA. It's a genetic type of thing, but it's not. I mean, no scientist, no medical doctor is ever going to do research and ever find, well, here's the sin gene. Here's the chromosome that causes sin. We will never discover that. And yet, some way, sin persists. It is passed on from generation to generation. And that is true all the way back to Adam. Well, Paul makes all of this very clear in this week's passage, and that is Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. And again, you might say, well, Andy, this is just a small portion of a larger passage, and you might cover more, and I might be able to cover more, but I really can't cover more in the amount of time. These three verses, in fact, some commentators say these three verses, and a part of these 10 verses, all the way through 21, are the most complicated verses that Paul has written, but especially related to these three verses. And I know I've said that about Romans before, in another part of Romans, but many people say this is some of the most complex understanding in all of the Bible. And part of that relates to verse 12. I'm going to unpack a little bit of that today, but I encourage you to watch tomorrow to get a little bit more. But what we see in this passage is that because of sin, there is a consequence. Now, I'm using the word consequence in the singular. I'm using the word sin in the singular. Because of sin, whether that's an individual sin or all sin put together as one sin, there is a consequence, singular. There are multiple consequences. If we lie, we might get in trouble. If we steal, we might go to jail. All kinds of consequences might happen. But if we sin, there is a consequence, singular, and that consequence is death. It's death. Well, that death, that consequence, is why this series is entitled And Justice for All, because there is a justice, there is a moment of justice, there is a reckoning that we must all make, that we all do face as a result of our sin, because we do all sin. And that reckoning, that justice, might be able to be passed on to one other. It can be passed on to one other, but only if we believe, only if we choose Jesus. But that's next week's message, so you're going to have to hold on to that till next week. But sin is real, and its consequence, singular, is great. And again, that consequence is death. So where did sin originate? Where did this idea come from? Why do we sin? And largely, it depends upon who you ask. So let's take a quick look at these verses, and but first let's take a look at a few options related to the origin of sin, or we might say the origin of evil. And I want to do that by giving three opposing views to Christianity. So I'm going to give you I'm going to try to unpack four total ideas about where sin originated. Three of those are outside of Christianity, and I'm going to be very brief on those for obvious reasons, and then I'm going to talk about what this passage says about sin. So first we have the idea of yin and yang. Now, if you've ever seen the yin and yang symbol, if you haven't, just pause the video for a minute, pop over to Google, type in yin yang, but it's the white and the black, and they're kind of intertwined here. And this symbol comes from Eastern philosophy, even Eastern religious thought. It's an ancient Chinese symbol that dates back as far as the 14th century BC, and just for comparative sake, it has nothing to do with the Bible, but just for comparison's sake, that's in the approximate time frame of Moses, again, comparatively. But the yin and the yang, it is a dualistic mindset. It is the idea of hot and cold, of fire and water. It is the idea of man and woman, of good and bad. It is anything that is dualistic. It relates to this idea of yin and yang. But it's not competing. It's not good versus evil. It is good and evil that must be together. They must coexist. And because they coexist, they actually work in conjunction with one another. In fact, if you look at the symbols, the yin has a part of the other color in it, and the yang has a part of the other color in it. So they are even though they are separated mainly, there is an overlap within them because there is this interrelationship. So, but as we can, actually, I should say, just as if you're familiar with the idea of Star Wars, if you've ever watched the Star Wars, this is very similar to the Force and the dark side. So as we think about evil, and this philosophy, again, is that you cannot have good without evil. You cannot have evil without good. It is simply impossible. And so both have existed since the universe began, and the universe began through this Chinese idea of qi, okay? The energy of qi. So that's one idea. The second idea is that of evolution. Now, if you are a strong believer in evolution, the idea is that humanity is still carrying animalistic behavior that we have not yet outgrown. That because we have come from animals, that those animalistic tendencies, those traits that animals have, the viciousness, all of those characteristics, we still have those within us, and it will eventually cease in a few more million years, or maybe longer. Of course, nobody knows at this point, but at some point it is possible that we will continue to outgrow these very evilish type traits, and that we will outgrow that. The problem with this is, the problem for many people that are strong in evolution, the problem with the idea of good and evil is that if you do something to offend me, and I do something to offend someone else, but they're not offended by it, so you do something to me, I do the same thing to somebody else, and they're not offended by it, well, then it's not really evil. What was done wasn't really evil. It's just how I interpret it. Because I thought what you did to me was evil, and that person didn't think what I did to them was evil. And therefore, morality must be subjective in this idea. Morality must be something that is personal to me. It is not this overarching good and evil. And I realize, that there's more argument to all of this, but I'm just trying to nutshell it for all of us. So how these traits got into animals, these animalistic traits, these evil traits got into animals, how they have passed on to humans, that's a part of the mystery still. But in this mindset, again, maybe a few million years, maybe longer, we will ideally, as humans, outgrow some of these tendencies, some of this evil. The third idea is a much more modern idea, and that comes from Marxism. I guess evolution in its form now, originated in the 19th century, but Karl Marx believed that capitalism, or the ideas behind that term, is the source of evil. The idea is that society is filled with two basic groups. There are the groups that have, and there are the groups that have not. And we see this all the time. We have the 1%ers, and we have the 99%ers, whatever it is. And we've heard these kinds of ideas now for many, many years. And so as long as some people have and some people do not have, that is going to create evil, because the people that do not have crave what the people that have do have. Well, in its purest form, this leads to communism. It's socialism, at least. It is communism at its fullest thing. And in that purest form, it means that all property is owned publicly. You don't own a house. I don't own a house. We all own each other's houses. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't have my job and you don't have your job and all of that, but all of this dates back, according to Marx. All of this goes back to the beginning of history, and although I can't prove this, but I couldn't find evidence of this, I would suggest that Marx's thought even would relate to the idea of Cain and Abel. That Abel had a sacrifice that was deemed worthy, Cain did not, and it was that jealousy, it was that have versus have not, in this case, not something they physically had, but the approval that they gained, the have and the have not, that caused Cain to kill Abel. Again, I could not find proof of that, but I would guess that may have come into Marx's thought at some point in the way. So the solution for removing evil, according to Marx, is to level society, that we are all on the same plane. There is a classless society, that everything is socialist in its nature, and that will destroy the system of the haves and the haves not. Now, those three are very prominent ideas, and depending upon who you ask, some will look at those and defend them very, very strongly. In summary, Eastern thought says you cannot have good without evil. Evolutionists say that evil may one day be expunged. Again, it might be a few million years. It's not going to help you or me. And Marx says that the demise of capitalism will resolve the human problem of evil. But God. God said that we're created good. Again, in fact, we are the premier portion of God's creation, that we as humanity were the last and the best of God's creation. In the first 5 days, God created, and He said it is good. And on the sixth day, He created, then He created man, and at the end, He said it is very good. So, a part of the goodness of God's creation was in Him giving us a choice in how we would live. It is a part of His love to us. He is not controlling us. He is not the puppeteer. He is not controlling us like a robot. He has given us choice. He has given us free will. And the problem, though, is that we choose poorly, and Adam specifically chose poorly on how to exercise that will, and we are still facing the consequences of that today. Consequences, plural, here. Well, I might say that Eve chose poorly because she partook of the fruit first, and then Adam followed, but it is Adam that got the blame. And now, eons later, we are still dealing with that, and Paul writes about this very fact in Romans 5, verses 12 through 14. So I want to highlight a few key thoughts on these verses, and then again, I'll dive deeper into each of these verses a little bit on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of this week. So the first thing that we want to look at in verse 12 is the problem of sin. The problem of sin is that we cannot escape it. We simply cannot escape sin. It is pervasive. It is on this side of the world, it is on the other side of the world, and it is everywhere in between. And that is all true because of the sin of one man, Adam. Now, certainly Paul knew the story of Genesis chapter 3. He knew that the woman took the fruit first, but the blame goes to Adam. He was the first human, and therefore he is responsible. But now we all sin, and that's the rub here. So according to Romans 5:12, because we all sin, well, we all die. Why is that true? Because sin is the worst pandemic. COVID may be ramping up again, but sin never stops. COVID may kill a percentage of the people that contract it, but sin kills everyone. Now, Paul's use of the word spread here comes to mind. Sin came into the world through one man, and this disease called sin has created chaos ever since. It has spread. People have looked for cures in all kinds of ways, not by the vaccines that teams are looking at today, but we've tried vaccines by sacrificing. We've tried vaccines by doing good works. We've tried vaccines by doing good generally, by trying to be good generally in ways. But the problem of sin is that it cannot be cured. Sin is real, and thus sin brings death. It brought death to Adam, it brought death to Eve, and it has brought death to everyone since, or for those of us who are living, it will bring death to us one day as well. Now, there isn't two exceptions to that already. One is Enoch from Genesis, who was walking and then was walking with God, and Elijah, who was taken up by the chariots in the fire from 1 Kings, 2 Kings. And so there is this. There are a couple of exceptions, and God can make exceptions. But the truth is that if you do the math, it will be 100%, because there are too many humans that have died against too many humans that have lived. Two exceptions do not change that math. So the problem of sin remains to this day. There is no inoculation that we can take. A vaccine will never exist. A cure is possible in the sense that if we die, physical death, we no longer have to deal with sin. We just have to pay for our sin. Or if we die to ourselves and receive Jesus, the gift of Jesus, and what His redeeming blood did for us, then, in a sense, the sin is cured, but we still sin. Again and again, the idea of Jesus, that explanation will have to wait till next week. That is much of the rest of this part of the passage. So, today's passage is confusing because if Adam sinned, why does that make us sin? There is nothing in his DNA that was passed to us. There is no genetics that are passed to us in some way. But even though it's not biological, in some way, shape, or form, we are infected. Again, for the sake of time, I'm going to talk about that in tomorrow's video. I'll try to break that down a little bit more tomorrow in tomorrow's video. But let us just acknowledge for today that truth is a problem, and that problem has existed ever since Adam took a bite of the forbidden fruit. So the problem of sin. The second issue then is the timing of sin, and we see this in Romans 5:13, which says, "For sin indeed was in the world before the law was given." Now, I just mentioned that this passage overall can be quite confusing, and there is a confusion about why do we sin even though Adam sinned and it doesn't pass through his genes or anything like that. It's not a cultural thing. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Why does that happen? That's a confusing part. Many people will be confused with verse 13 as well, because Paul says that the sin was in the world before the law. And specifically, he's talking about the Mosaic law, which would have been of particular interest to a large portion of the people that are reading this letter back then. But there is a logical problem to this that I want to help to try to explain today. And again, on Tuesday, I will give some more examples and try to flesh that out. Again, for the sake of time, I'm deferring that to another day. So, the initial challenge relates to the question of how sin could lead to death if the law had not been given. That is, if I don't know that something is wrong, then why should I die for that? It's a valid question. It's a very good question. It's a question that Paul anticipated, and so he gives us this brief little statement here that, but sin is not counted where there is no law. If we go back to chapter 4, verse 15, let me read that for us. Romans 4:15. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. Different word here, and that's important. In chapter 5, verse 13, Paul's talking about sin. In chapter 4, verse 15, he mentions the idea of transgression. Now, a lot of times these two words are used synonymously, but they do not have the same meaning. Sin means to miss the mark. A lot of times in the Roman culture, in the Greek word, the original Greek word, it was the idea of shooting an arrow and not hitting the bullseye. Okay? But a transgression, on the other hand, is crossing the line. Now, let me just state very, very plainly, if you transgress, if you commit a transgression, if you cross a line, you have sinned, you have missed the mark. But it is possible to miss the mark without transgressing. Adam transgressed. Adam knew that he was not to partake of a particular fruit on a particular tree. Once the law came during the time of Moses, the people knew what they were not to do. And famously, the infamous 10, do not make any false images, don't take the Lord's name in vain, do not commit murder, do not lie, do not steal, those kinds of things. Do not do those things. You now know the law. If you break that law, then you have committed a transgression. But everybody between Adam and Eve and Moses died. Abraham died. That's recorded in the Bible and such. And so, with that, they didn't have the same law, so why did they die? Well, it is sin that leads to death, not transgression. As Romans 4:15 says, for the law brings wrath. And the law comes about when it is known. That is when a transgression can happen. Adam transgressed. He crossed a line. He knew he was not supposed to eat the fruit from the tree of good and evil, but he did so anyway. That is a transgression. When the Mosaic law was given, the people knew what they were not supposed to do, and when they did it, that was a transgression. They broke the law. But all those people in between, they didn't have the law, but they are still guilty of sin. They still missed the mark. Missing the mark does not mean that you crossed a line. It could mean that you didn't go to the line. It could mean, if you think about going back to the arrow idea, it's not hitting the bullseye. You may have still hit the target, but you didn't hit the bullseye. You missed the mark, that ultimately you were aiming for. You weren't told that if you miss this mark, you weren't told that if you don't get the bullseye, you fail, but you missed the mark, or maybe the arrow fell short. I'll talk about that a little bit as it relates to Romans 3:23 on Tuesday. So these people, such as Abraham, such as Joseph, they all missed the mark, and because of that, they sinned, same meaning, and as Paul wrote in the previous verse, death spread to all men because all sinned. Death comes from sin, not necessarily transgression. And so even though we use sin and transgression interchangeably so often, there is a distinction that we must understand and we must make. Once the law is in place, you can transgress, but until the law is in place, you cannot. The law was not given ex post facto. That is a term that means that you cannot be held responsible for a law that had not yet been written. The U.S. Constitution, for instance, says that if you commit an act that is later deemed wrong, it is later called a crime, you cannot be held responsible for that. So just as a for instance, if the U.S. allowed people to steal, and then a law was put into place that says you can't steal or you're going to go to jail, any thefts that you made prior to that law being put in place, you could not be held accountable for. That is a part of the U.S. Constitution. It is a part of the Bible. God honors that as well. So, again, I encourage you for a couple more clarifying examples. Watch the video on Tuesday to get a better idea. But it is sin that carries the consequence, not just transgression. And the consequence of sin is death. The third thing that I want to say is that death reigns. And again, the issue that sin has is that it is pervasive. It affects the world in so many ways, but the result to which sin leads is the real problem. Adam transgressed God's command and sin entered the world. Before that happened, God provided a warning about the consequence. You will die. And since the forbidden bite was taken, ever since that moment, death has reigned. Now, I know people will make the argument, Adam took the fruit and he ate it and he didn't die. But he did. In that moment, things changed. What I truly believe is that God created the world in 6 days. On the seventh day he rested. Adam did not partake of the fruit on day 8 or even day 7. I find that very, very challenging to believe. And I don't have time to unpack that here. That'll be for a different day, a different video somewhere along the way. But the idea is that it may have been days, weeks, months, years, thousands of years. We don't know how long it was. It could have been the next day. I struggle to believe that. And I have some reasons for that. But so Adam lived all that time and did not have any issues. He theoretically could have lived forever because he did have access to the tree of life. Well, after sin, we see what happens immediately. He partakes of the fruit and immediately he hides from God. Immediately he is shamed of his nakedness, as is Eve. Immediately they find a tearing from one another. They find a tearing from God, and in a sense, that is death. It was not physical death, but there was the beginning of separation. Man had never experienced separation before, and separation carries the idea of death, that there is an ending of sorts. So physical death is not the ultimate death. Spiritual death is. Sure, on this side of life, when somebody passes, when somebody dies, and we do have grief. And that's okay. We should have grief. But as Paul says, if they are a Christian, they're just asleep. They will rise again. They will be with Jesus. And if we know Jesus and they know Jesus, then it's just a temporary separation. It's like when we go to bed tonight and we wake up the next morning and say, "Hi, how you doing?" Someday we will have that opportunity again. But spiritual death is the bigger death, and that is what happened. That is what transpired the moment that Adam partook of the forbidden fruit. And spiritual death is separation from God. Both spiritual death and physical death were unknown to Adam before the fruit. But from that moment, death has reigned. Sin and death will work hand in hand. Their power, their authority is unstoppable, save for one man. Again, that comes next week. That's next week's lesson. They don't listen to others for counsel. Sin and death do not have to listen for others for counsel. They are in control. But 1 Corinthians 15, I'll preview this. 1 Corinthians 15, 55 and 56 say, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." Again, that will be next week's message, our message of hope. In America, the reality is that we don't understand monarchical rule. We don't have a king. And when we had a king, we didn't like it, and we revolted against the king. What we have is a right to vote. And every 4 years, just like we did a couple of weeks ago, we exercise that right to vote. And in doing so, if we don't like the candidate who is voted in this time, we can change that candidate, potentially. We can cast a vote to change that candidate the next time around. Sometimes we're going to like those who are in charge. Other times we are not going to like those who are in charge. But that's the beauty of a democracy, or in our case, a democratic republic, is that we have the option to change. But death is not like that. See, a president does not rule, a president leads. But death is a tyrant. Death is not a ruler who can be manipulated. Death is not a ruler who can be controlled. We cannot negotiate with death. We cannot beat death. Death is the ruler, and and death's rule is supreme, or at least so he thought, again, next week with Jesus. So we've talked about death, and we've talked about sin, and we've talked about transgression, and we've talked about Adam, and we've talked about the origin of sin from evil and from the original sin perspective. And the biblical perspective of this is quite different than the others. It's not the yin and the yang. It's not the evolutionary idea that maybe 1 million years from now or 10 million years from now or eventually maybe we'll outgrow sin. Or it's not the Marxist idea that as long as everybody can raise to the same level or lower to that level with pure socialism, then we can have that. And of those three, by the way, that's the only one that's possible in our lifetime. Yin and yang will always exist, Eastern thought. Again, evolution, millions of years, maybe. We could have, in a socialist system, we could have equality. But we've seen what happens in the world when that happens. In 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, and then turn around almost 75 years later or whatever with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the destruction of the Berlin Wall. We see what that kind of process will lead to. It still does not create the utopia that many people hopes that it will create. But God says something else. God says that evil is a choice. Sin is our choice to separate ourselves from God. Sin is our choice to make us God over God, even if it's for a moment, even if it's for a day, is to say that my ways, my will is better than your ways and your will. Man had the option to do the right thing. Specifically, Adam had the option to do the right thing. Adam chose poorly, and now because of that, we sin as well. Adam chose a path away from God. We often choose a path away from God, but God. God chose a path, made a way, capital W, made the way, Jesus, to allow us to have a path back to Him, to take that separation that we desire. Why else would we sin? And to instead give us an opportunity to desire Him and be unseparated, to be the children of God that He calls us to be. Again, the problem with the other theories is that they're not overly helpful. Yin and yang is not helpful. You and I aren't going to be here to experience evolution when we no longer have evil. Marxism maybe, but again, we still see the results of that 75 years after what has happened just about a century ago for us. But as it relates to God, that choice that He gave us, even though that He knew that we could do wrong, even though He knew that we would do wrong, God always had a plan to make a way for us to be restored to Him. And that plan is the redemptive blood of Jesus. It simply shows the goodness of God to love His creation that much. Thus, our journey letter today is R for revere. If a God will love us that much, to not only give us choice, but to know that we made the wrong choice, and He will still give us the opportunity for a second chance and a second choice to restore us back to Him, how can we not revere God? How can we not worship God? How can we not desire God? Am I perfect in that? Not at all. Not at all. But hopefully I'm growing in that. Hopefully you're growing in that. Or at least hopefully maybe I've given you some thoughts to consider why that would be true to grow towards Him. We are to worship. As Paul wrote in the preceding verses, including verse 11, but 3 times in that preceding passage, we are to rejoice. And rejoicing is a part of worship. So our next step again this week, like last week, is that we are to love. It begins with loving God. That is a part of our worship. That is why we worship. Worship is not coming and standing in a church or listening to a radio and hearing songs or maybe even singing the songs. Worship is about our heart. It's something that we can't see, but it's something that we can feel. Yes, it includes singing. It includes all those, or can include all those things, but it is something deeper within us. But it's not just about loving God and worshiping God. It is about loving others. For as God said, as Jesus said, we are to love the Lord our God and to love others as we love ourselves. But the choice is that we all tend to choose another other. We choose death. We choose sin instead of choosing Christ. And if we love God, if we want to honor God, then we must also want to honor others by helping them to not know the truth of death. Let me say that differently. We want them to know the truth of death. We want them to know that sin leads to death. We don't want them to experience, is what I meant to say a moment ago. We don't want them to experience death and the harshness and that consequence of sin. We want them to know the truth. We want them to know the hope that comes through Jesus Christ, the one that provided the victory for us, the one that we will focus on in next week's lesson, the one by God's grace and by God's mercy came to give victory not only for him, but for us as well. That person, as Paul writes in that next section, Jesus Christ, our Lord. That is the hope that we can have to overcome our sin, to overcome that consequence of death. And ladies and gentlemen, we need to be sharing that with others too. Because sin will not be cured. There is no cure for the virus of sin apart from Jesus. And if you know him, you already have that cure. So help spread that cure to others. God, we do thank you for your love, for your grace, for the mercy that you have shown us through Jesus. And Lord, as so many have studied this before me, so many are much smarter than me and know things so much better than I do. And as I've looked at these verses this week, there's challenges here. This idea of sin originated through Adam, I believe that. But how does that pass to me? It's not cultural, it's not genetic, but it does. It's a choice that I make to sin because of the choice that he made to sin. But God, the greater choice, the greater truth, and one that we'll focus on so much more next week. As we saw last week, you are that but God kind of God. That the choice that you made is greater than the choice that we made. The power of your choice overcomes the power of our choice. Our choice for sin and a consequence of death is outdone by your choice to send your Son and Jesus' choice to go to the cross and Jesus' choice to die for us and your power to bring him back from the dead. And therefore we have that choice that if we put our trust in him, that justice that must fall upon us has already fallen upon us in the person of Jesus. But we must believe, we must put our faith in that truth. So God, despite the confusion that this passage brings, and maybe a little bit of clarity that I brought, or maybe I've made it more confusing, or the videos this week, how they might play out, God, let us, in all of that, let us take from this that you are the great God, you are the good God who loved us enough to give us choice and loved us even more to redeem us from the choice that we would make. Because of that, God, let us love you. Let us share that love with others that they might know you as well. For it's in the name of the one that we place our hope, that we place our trust, that we have our faith, that name of Jesus, that we pray. Amen.